On April 4th, 1994, Dr. William Kelso launched the Jamestown Rediscovery Project, which sought to establish the location of the 17th century settlement called James Fort. James Fort, the first permanent English settlement in North America, was popularly thought to have fallen into the James River after centuries of erosion on the island's western bank, at the time that Kelso started looking for it. After 3 archaeological seasons, Kelso and his team had enough finds to establish that, though portions of the western side of the fort had fallen into the river, a majority of it was still on dry land. On November 14, 2019, we visited Historic Jamestowne to see what Kelso and those who have continued his work have uncovered. Today on Historia Nostra, we're walking through the original site of James Fort and considering how visitors can learn about its history through archaeology. James Fort was established in 1607 to protect the colonists sent there by the Virginia Company from the Powhatan Confederacy, a confederacy of indigenous communities who did not take kindly to the strangers invading their territory. The Powhatan Confederacy, and especially the Passaic, whose territory included the peninsula John Smith and the others had decided to take with an eye on exploiting the surrounding landscape, launched several attacks on these invaders soon after their arrival. The earliest fort, with 3 bulwarks forming a triangle, as recreated at the site today, was completed by June 15th of 1607. Walking through the visitor center and following the footpath through wetlands, we got our first look at James Fort, with its great Union flag flying over the eastern side of the palisade. Walking further, we were drawn towards the Tercentenary Monument, which was placed here in 1907. It reads, Jamestown, the first permanent colony of the English people, the birthplace of Virginia in the United States, May 13, 1607. There are several panels spaced out along the path, describing the location and the journey that the settlers took to arrive at it. Walking on, I'm drawn towards the old church that stands above the rest of the site. When the church was first constructed here in 1617, it would have been within the palisade walls, which stretched further east to form a 5-pointed structure, but the current memorial church stands atop the 1617 foundation and sticks out from the palisades, recreating the 1607 boundary. Making my way through the main gates of the site, a large sculpture of an indigenous woman meets me. Sure enough, this is a tribute to Pocahontas, and the panels beside her figure offer a few details about her life. I'm going to call her Matoaka, because that was her name, as can be seen on the border of this portrait of her. Matoaka was given her Christian name Rebecca when she was baptized, also shown here. Pocahontas was her mother's name, which her father was known to call her by. The panels don't deviate away from the standard and somewhat mythologized version of her story. Matoaka was Chief Powhatan's favored daughter. She converted to Christianity and married John Rolfe, enjoying a brief spell of peace between their peoples before her father's death in 1622. It's still quiet in the fort. We've arrived as the park opened to beat the field trip traffic that crowd sites like this during the fall. The interpreter at the Welcome Center told us that over 300 kids were expected to visit the site the day we visited. The only other people here now are archaeologists at work in a tent beside the church tower, who come out to talk to me and eagerly answer my questions. They tell me that they're digging a grave they found unexpectedly as they were working on the area around the church's exterior walls, which is of particular interest to them because the grave is on the church's eastern side, and most of the graves they've uncovered have been on the western side, leading them to excavate the grave and try to discern why this individual was buried here, a spot likely to indicate that he was an outcast or died dishonorably. These archaeologists work with Preservation Virginia, who have had ongoing excavations here since Dr. Kelso launched Rediscovering Jamestown in 1994, and who consider educating the public about their work such as by excavating in plain sight of visitors and answering our questions, part of the job. After thanking them, I continue into the church tower and quickly realize that the tower is older than the rest of the structure. Plaques inside confirm that the interior of the chapel has been reconstructed. The current memorial chapel is the 5th church in James Fort and the 4th on this site. The original 1607 church was constructed in the center of the fort, while the churches built after 1617 were here at the eastern palisade. Windows allow us to look at the remains of walls and flooring of the original church, and the grave in the chancel, a part of the building close to the altar. It's suspected, based on the date of the church and the position of the grave in this distinguished spot under the chancel, which was marked on the floor with the knight's tombstone, which is visible today, that this grave belongs to Sir George Yeardley, who was Lord Governor at the time of his death in 1626. Exiting to the right of the sanctuary, I come into the gravesite, where 29 early fort period grave shafts were found, of which 3 have been excavated. These graves revealed 1 single and 2 double burials. The double burials likely contained men who died on the same day, as noted on the archival record. The single grave was identified as a 14-year-old boy, and the presence of a stone projectile in the grave suggests that he was likely killed during a Paspag attack in the early months of settlement. Other crosses distributed around the site demark later burials. The 1607 burials were kept within the walls of the fort in order to hide the number of deaths the colonists had suffered, for fear that the neighboring Powhatans would seize upon their increasing vulnerability to drive them out if the true number of deaths and the illness that they suffered became known. Walking past the graves, I follow the line of the palisades walking northeast until I come to the first bulwark. There would have been cannon platforms here, and in the 2 matching bulwarks on the other ends of the fort that are now underwater. Along the northern wall, 2 row houses are marked out. It's strange to imagine hundreds of people occupying this space. The number of buildings that have been reconstructed here are minimal, probably to preserve the archaeology and access to it, but there is a large sculpture at the center of the site that recreates what the fort would have looked like and gives information on the structures uncovered over the years of excavations. Check out the link to the site map in the description for more detail on the buildings that have been identified. Beyond this point is a statue of John Smith, staring out over the water. I wonder if the site has chosen to include statues of Smith and Matoaka exclusively because of the popularity of the story made infamous by Disney's 1995 film, Pocahontas. Their story was much different than the tale we all know, but I'll get into that in my next video on Jamestown, where I'll take up Terrence Malick's 2005 film, The New World, and its presentation of the founding of Jamestown. We walked out of the fort and along the seawall, built in 1900, to prevent further erosion of the site, towards the Archeology, a museum that exhibits some of the finds from James Fort's excavations, and offer a brief history of the site and how the finds help us understand this history. For example, items excavated from a disused well give insights into the types of items the fort's occupants threw away, as it was not uncommon for trash to be tossed into well shafts once no longer in use. For me, I don't like how both the information in the fort site and in the Archaeologium couch the indigenous history of the site within the mythology around Matoaka. This choice probably indicates Preservation Virginia and the Park Service's way to meet visitor expectations coming into the site, but as an historian coming in with more background in both the site's history and of Matoaka's life, I think this perpetuates a very romantic telling of what is, in reality, a tragic story. Jamestown Island was, in the 17th century, a peninsula considered part of the Paspag territory, but the interpretive materials on site simply state that the area was not used by nearby Indigenous communities at the time of settlement. The history of this defensive fort, cut into the natural landscape, is a monument to the site's violent past, but the interpretive emphasis is placed on Jamestown as a birthplace of American society, as it is now known, which undermines the tenuous position these settlers were in by painting the history of this site as a story of perseverance. The history told here quickly loses sight that Jamestown was established as a commercial venture, not with ambitions of building a nation. But this raises questions about who the site is for. Being here during the fall reminds us just how popular the site is with school groups, and the site also attracts a large number of tourists, like myself. Heritage sites sustain themselves on public interest in what they offer, and the public in this case come here expecting to see John Smith, Pocahontas, and the story about how America was born. People who work in heritage have to balance these kinds of expectations with good, fact-based histories, which is no easy task. Academically trained historians like me might have the patience and desire to read long explanatory panels that give a thorough and nuanced interpretation of the site, but a fourth grader here on field trip certainly doesn't share that interest. I don't know if it's possible to curate a site like this in a way that will satisfy every visitor. Personally, I like the way that Historic Jamestowne emphasizes the archaeological evidence that's been uncovered here, while providing only minimal explanatory panels about the broader history of the site. Exposure to the remains of James Fort, supplemented with visual aids, like the reconstructed palisades, which are backed by archaeological evidence, encourages visitors to consider the process of excavating the site and how narratives about the ways people lived in the past can be discerned from the physical remains of their settlements. The way the site pieces together the lived experiences of those who settled here in the 17th century through interpreting archaeological finds and the remains of structures is effective, in my opinion, because this method does not seek to answer large questions or make explicit arguments about the site's importance. Contrasted with living museums like Jamestown Settlement, which we talked about in the first episode of this series, this site definitely has fewer hands-on activities. The staff have set up a pit behind the fort's northern palisade that they use to guide school kids through exploratory digs, but for the average visitor, I'm not sure this site would be as engaging for children as its living history counterpart. This is why I've decided to start this series at Jamestown. The combination of a historic site with a separate living history museum that recreates it nearby is not a model many historic sites have the budget or visitorship to mimic, and most strike a balance between living history, or interactive components, and the built heritage. Each approach offers pros and cons, but to emphasize one is often to sacrifice the other. This is something we'll keep thinking about as we continue to experience history at living history and heritage sites across North America. For now, let us know which Jamestown Museum you prefer and why in the comments. Historic Jamestown invites visitors to walk among the physical remains of the 17th century fort and observe the archaeological processes by which we can learn about its history or confirm what's on the written record. While the museum oversimplifies the indigenous history of this region, it's extremely effective in the way it presents the settler history of this site. If you'd like to learn more about Historic Jamestown, check out the resources in the description, and join us next time as we discuss Terrence Malick's 2005 film, The New World. Footage from my trip down to Virginia is courtesy of Christie, and our music is by Brook for Free. You can learn more at brookforfree.bandcamp.com.